So I was just saying to the three speakers, I'm going to be brief because this session is shorter than the sessions were yesterday, and these guys are all brilliant and have a heck of a lot more to say than I do. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the topic. This session is about essentially smart aid, looking at how do we make development dollars go much farther than they currently are. How do we take the focus off of just throwing more money towards problems that we haven't seen able to change and solve in many, many years, and rather address the question of how do we really strengthen the quality of what we're doing. So we have three great speakers. I'm going to briefly introduce them. First, Owen Barter. Owen is the director of an organization called Aid Info, which is a major player in advancing aid transparency internationally. In a previous life, Owen was director of Africa for Department for International Development in the UK government, and has also served in 10 Downing Street working with Tony Blair and in the Treasury as well. We have Ian Smiley, who is a Canadian legend in development circles, chair of the Diamond Development Initiative, and somebody who was instrumental in putting together the Kimberley process, and is also a well-known author who's written extensively on development issues. And we also have Larry Knowles, who is a friend from the United States, who has over 30 years of experience in Congress working on foreign aid and development issues. Was a member of President-elect Obama's transition team advising on development, and is also currently the U.S. policy director for the One campaign, and is a principal core contributor to something called the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network in the United States, which is about reforming U.S. aid. So I'm going to please ask if Owen could get us started, and then we're going to have Ian and last Larry.
I'm going to make 4 points, and I'm going to make them very briefly, and so perhaps in an unsatisfying way, so let's talk about them in the discussion afterwards. And they're this. First, let's be clear about what aid can and cannot do. I think there's been a tendency in the aid business to make ever increasingly grandiose claims. Originally, aid was intended as emergency relief and to provide basic services to people. That's back in the 1940s, 50s and 60s. And over the decades, we've increasingly claimed that we can transform societies, that we can accelerate economic growth, we can accelerate political change and institutional change. And the evidence for those grandiose claims is rather thin. We've tried a lot, and we haven't got very many successes to show for it. But we have done a huge amount to send kids to school, to vaccinate children, to give people access to clean water, to reduce infant and maternal mortality. We've made more progress on that in the last 50 years than we have in the previous 500 years. And so when we say aid is not as effective as we want it to be, the question is against what standard? Because on the standard of just delivering basic services to people while their countries develop, we're doing a pretty good job. And I think that there are things we can do to accelerate development in poor countries, but they're not mainly with aid. They're to do with trade policy, to do with corruption, to do with tax information sharing, to do with intellectual property rights, all those kinds of things I think could affect how quickly poor countries develop. I don't think aid makes a huge lot of difference to that, and I don't think we should pretend that it does. That's my first point. The second point is that I think on the things that aid is good for, it is preposterous that we have so little evidence about what works. I find myself squarely in the Esther Duflo camp of saying we are like 18th century, barbers bleeding people and applying leeches because we haven't done proper rigorous analysis about the effectiveness of different kinds of intervention. I think we should be doing much more impact evaluation, and I think we should be doing much less of the kind of M&E work that goes on in the aid industry, much less of the consultants flying out and interviewing people about whether the log frame was filled in properly and whether there was a stakeholder workshop and whether all that stuff. And we should do much more rigorous impact evaluation. I think for most aid agencies, the rule should be if you want to spend money on something, you either have to identify the rigorous evaluation that shows that it's going to work, or you have to do one. There shouldn't be an option to be spending money on something for which there isn't good evidence that it's an effective intervention, unless you are at the same time providing evidence. And I think that's true of almost all aid agencies. They should be making a major push in that direction. And in saying that, I think that we have to not add that on to the existing aid bureaucracy. The existing aid bureaucracy, the requirement to fill in, my partner runs an NGO in Ethiopia, and she had to fill in a 17-page form for an aid donor recently. All kinds of garbage about, she had to provide an organogram of the organisation, what was the nationality of each of the people. And, at one point they were querying why was she paying severance payments to people on these short-term contracts, and the answer was because that's Ethiopian law. But they had to. All this stuff was a substitute for the fact, in most cases, that we don't have good measures of impact. We satisfy ourselves about how the money is spent because we don't have adequate measures of what it produces. But when you go shopping, you don't require the supermarket to provide you their accounts about how much did it cost to bring this good to the supermarket, and how much did they spend on petrol, and how much are they paying. You buy the product, and if the price isn't right for you, you go to a different shop. And it seems to me that a lot of the bureaucracy of aid is associated with the fact that we're not measuring outputs properly, and we could and should get rid of a lot of the stuff that makes our life a misery by doing proper output measures. My third point is about transparency. It will seem very strange, I think, in a few years' time that we could be spending $120 billion a year on foreign assistance and not really have any idea where it's going. And we have, that information exists, it's in the systems of aid agencies and NGOs and philanthropy organisations. And we should be making that raw data publicly available so that we can apply our collective wisdom to it, so we can learn from it, so that we can see what happens, so that people whose money it is have more confidence that it's arriving, so that money that isn't arriving stops flowing, so that money that's more effective flows more, so that the intended beneficiaries can articulate their priorities about how they want that money spent and whether it's making an impact. All those things are obviously true. There is no reason at all why this information shouldn't be publicly available from all these organisations, and it's a collective. We need the collective will to make it happen. We're moving in that direction now. It seems to me surprising, given Canada's proud history on transparency, that Canada is not a signatory of the International Aid Transparency Initiative. It seems to me that the US has now announced that they're going to be publishing their data consistent with it. So why isn't Canada doing it? But across not just official donors, but NGOs and philanthropic organisations, this information is public good information that we ought to be sharing and making available. And I think that accountability is going to be the thing that drives improvements in the aid system over time. And we can see what it costs, what's working and what's not working, and when we can empower citizens in developing countries to provide us with feedback, that's what's going to drive change in the system. No amount of policy from on high is going to change it effectively as people being able to see in real time what's happening. And that takes me to my fourth point. And I think this is perhaps more speculative and further down the line, but I think it's happening. There is a change in citizens' relationships with their public services. A few years ago, you would have gone to a travel agent to book a flight, and the travel agent would have had a computer screen facing them, and they would have told you what they thought the best flight was for you to take, what the best holiday was. Today, most of you, I guess, would go online. You'd go to Expedia or Orbitz or Travelocity or something. You'd look at your own flights, you'd decide which one you wanted to buy. The information is aggregated for you by those services, and you get a choice about how you want to spend your money and what flight you want, and how you want to trade off price and convenience and timing and so on. And that's increasingly true across public services, that citizens expect to be engaged in the public service. They want to be able to make real choices, they want to know what's happening to their money, they want to be able to participate in it. But aid agencies today are like travel agents of the past. They're basically saying, give us the money and we'll spend it for you. And we'll give you a bit of a report at the end of each year with some glossy photographs about how it went. Citizens are not going to accept that anymore. They want to know how their money is being used. And they want to be able to exercise a bit more influence and choice. Not every citizen is going to be participating in choices about aid spending, but enough people, and many of them in here, are interested enough in this that they want to be part of that process. And aid agencies can either be the travel agents and gradually fall into obsolescence, or they can reinvent themselves as Travelocity or Orbits of the future. They can be the platform on which citizens get to participate in choices about how their aid money is spent and see what the results of that money are. And they are not, and if aid agencies, official aid agencies don't do it, someone else will. And the collective will to provide money through the tax system to aid agencies will evaporate and people will provide their money through other platforms instead. So I think there's a real challenge ahead for aid agencies. I think they're stuck in a very 1970s corporatist view of the relationship between the citizen and the state and the services they expect. And I think they're going to need to change pretty quick if they're going to survive. So those are my 4 points. First, let's be clear about what aid can and cannot do. Second, let's do proper impact evaluation and use that to simplify the gubbins of the development system. Third, transparency and accountability are what's going to drive improved aid. And fourth, what we need over time is a platform for citizen engagement in development, rather than the idea that they're going to delegate the task to us. Thanks very much.
Yesterday, Owen said that Americans always start a presentation with a joke, and the British always start with an apology. Canadians are somewhere in between. We spell color with a U, and we spell tire with an I. So I'm going to start with, that's my joke. So let me move to the apology. The apology is that I'm going to make a formal presentation. I find it very hard to keep to 10 minutes if I'm just speaking from bullet points. And I got a lot to say, and I want to make sure I say it right. Against a backdrop of growing international debate about the quality, volume, and purpose of foreign aid, CEDA tried in 1969 to clarify the aims and objectives of Canadian development assistance. An aid memoir at the time listed a number of problems in reaching clear objectives. First, our aid program until now has been intellectually incoherent. Second, all governments state the wrong motives for their international aid. Third, we should give underdeveloped nations enough aid to keep them quiet. Fourth, a principal foreign policy objective is to find a policy which will help the best possible relationship with the United States. This list in itself may seem intellectually incoherent and not a little disingenuous, but a subsequent background paper was even more revealing of the views at the time. And this is CEDA, and this is 1969, the year of the Pearson Report, Partners in Development. It suggested that Canada's motives for providing development assistance should fulfill 3 objectives in the following order. First would be the political objective to establish within the recipient countries those political attitudes or commitments, military alliances or military bases that would assist Canada or Canada's Western allies to maintain a reasonably stable and secure international political system. A second objective might be the establishment of markets for Canadian products and services. A third objective might be the relief of famine and personal misery. Security and political concerns were unambiguously first, commercial interests second, and the relief of famine and personal misery third. CEDA's 40-year inability to satisfy its many supporters and critics stems inevitably from this continuing and conflictive trinity of objectives. A perceived need to address all of them at the same time has been confused by the changing weight given to each of them by the government of the day, by CEDA's ever-changing senior management, and pressures applied in favor of one objective or another by Parliament, by NGOs, the private sector, the media, military, academia, and others. The time, in my view, has come to end the confusion and to understand that two primary objectives, one frequently stated and the other not, must underscore all of Canada's development assistance programs. The stated objective, to end poverty, has been endorsed by every Canadian government since Lester Pearson chaired that 1969 commission that produced Partners in Development. This has to do with Canadian values, good international citizenship, and justice. The less frequently stated objective has to do with self-interest, not the self-interest of short-term political or commercial advantage, but as de Tocqueville put it, self-interest properly understood. Canada's medium and long-term security depends on a world that's safe from pandemics, ecological disaster, uncontrolled human migration, terrorism, and conflicts whose boundaries transcend international borders, wrecking lives, infrastructure, and long-term investment. The combined UN peacekeeping costs this year in Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and the Congo exceed the combined development assistance to those countries by a factor of at least 3. And the wars they seek to contain wrecked most of the infrastructure created by development assistance over the past 2 decades. Some of that development assistance was Canadian, and some of the peacekeeping costs are Canadian. Historically, CEDA has been treated by Canadian governments as a bit player, a department populated by amateurs with a large amount of money that should be made available for the priority of the day. It's also been criticized as an outlier, the antithesis of a team player. Natural Resources Canada, for example, complained bitterly that CEDA pays scant attention to its effort in support of Canadian mining firms in developing countries. In other words, CEDA has been reluctant to divert its attention and dollars to NRCan priorities. CEDA, in fact, deserves credit for being able to resist this kind of pressure. The development assistance budget should not be a slush fund for other departments with international interests. This isn't to deny the importance of NRCan's priorities. It's to say that if they're not directly related to CEDA's primary objectives, the money should be found elsewhere. CEDA, however, has actually failed to resist these kinds of pressures over and over. I sometimes ask people if they could name Canada's biggest development project of all time, and I bet few of you could. Canada's biggest bilateral project of all time was support for railways in Bangladesh. There may have been a developmental justification for this, but the need in Bangladesh railways at the time was not for rolling stock and motive power, precisely what Canada supplied because of commercial pressures at home. China was, for many years, one of Canada's top aid recipients. China, it was said, had many poor people. Well, so does Dubai. The motive in China, as it is today in the creation of new aid programs in middle-income Peru and Colombia, was largely, if not exclusively, commercial. Canada's foreign aid program behaves like the procurer through the ages, subverting its primary objective and Canada's longer-term interests to short-term commercial and political gain. In retrospect, it might be asked exactly how Canada benefited in the end from the provision of rolling stock to the Bangladesh railways, and whether CEDA programs in China, large for Canada, tiny for China, actually gained us any political or commercial advantage. It could be asked today whether the announcement of aid programs in Colombia and Peru have in any way advanced Canadian advantage in our free trade negotiations with those countries. The opportunity cost in these investments is very high compared to what might have been achieved in directing our efforts to CEDA's stated primary objective. The problem is not that CEDA has been an outlier, unwilling to play its part in Canada's overall foreign policy. The problem is that successive governments have ignored the possibility that the first purpose of foreign aid, the alleviation of poverty and all that might flow from it, should actually be a major component of Canada's overall foreign policy. If the alleviation of poverty in developing countries were to become a major foreign policy objective, 2 things would follow. First, that objective must be understood and accepted by all government departments. All must get behind the objective, just as they must with other foreign policy objectives. Commercial and political interests will remain, obviously, but they would be pursued through other means and other budgets. Second, Canada needs a strong Department for International Development with a full cabinet minister who can represent, protect, and advance this objective visibly and consistently, inside cabinet and out. Canada, once a leader, has become an embarrassment in international development circles. We've become a gold standard for inconsistency and unreliability among our peers and partners, due in large part to weak ministers with weak mandates, and a view that the development assistance envelope is available to meet the whims not just of the latest appointee, but the government as a whole. Parliamentary committees, studies, inquiries, commissions, and promises to do better have come and gone. But Canada's once proud aid program has become weaker and weaker over the past 20 years, failing to meet its stated objective and failing to satisfy its critics and its supporters. More importantly, it's failed to address Canada's long-term self-interest in dealing clearly and forthrightly with the challenge that underscores all other challenges coming from the developing world, poverty. A strong ministry with a full cabinet minister could make the change that Canada so badly needs in what has become a moribund exercise. Such a ministry needs more, however. It needs a clear mandate that will allow it to create a strong cadre of professionals who can develop, lead, and manage Canada's aid program. It must be able to reduce the red tape that has made CEDA one of the slowest and most bureaucratic departments in government and the slowest donor in the OECD. It must be able to change evaluation from the narrow policing ethic of today into one that fosters genuine learning and the ability to take small wins to scale. It must have the ability and the imagination to capture the enthusiasm of Canada's youth, the tens of thousands of young people who are genuinely concerned about the future of the planet and who want to find meaningful ways to contribute. And it must be able to explain to all Canadians why development assistance is so important, not just for them today, but for their children and grandchildren tomorrow. This task can no longer be entrusted to a department headed by an insecure junior minister acting as a puppy dog for the Prime Minister's office. It requires a department, a mandate, and a minister who can sit as an equal with cabinet colleagues when Canada's role in the world is being charted, ensuring that Canada's development assistance will play a full role in the whole of government approach, and that the whole of government will embrace Canada's development assistance agenda as its own. Thank you.
This is probably better. Good morning. I clearly cannot start off with a joke. That's been settled. But I do want to compliment Ian on being introduced as a legend in Canadian development. I'm usually introduced as a fossil in American development. No, it's a truth. It's not a joke. I actually retired from this business about 5 years ago after spending, as James said, 30 years working for the U.S. Congress. And I actually, when I kind of got drawn back into this, I was giving tours at a winery in the Finger Lakes, not very far from here. And oftentimes I stop and think of why I'm not still doing that. And then I come to Toronto in January and I remember why I'm not doing that. The cold weather is not my thing. 3 or 4 years ago, or about the time I retired, I could have just given a speech that Ian just gave and substituted USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, for what he said about CEDA. Some of the same concerns, complaints. But I have to say that it's really been exciting in the last 3 years to see this policy issue about greater aid effectiveness in the United States take hold and actually move from debate, discussion, to policy declarations now. But of course, the hard work is just beginning on implementing those policy recommendations and to get traction within our long-term bureaucracy for moving forward. I'll start off with, I think James was right on to set up this session about it's not about quantity, it's about quality and effectiveness. And there's been a lot of reasons for focusing on this for a long time. Some of the things Owen said, you know, quantity certainly doesn't necessarily translate into results. Sometimes when I look at the details of how the Development Assistance Committee in Paris defines official development assistance, and we always measure about what country does what in terms of ODA, and the U.S. is, of course, usually last, has been, except once in a while there's one country that dips down below us, makes us feel good that we're only 21st out of 22nd rather than dead last. But I also, when I look at those details of what counts as ODA and what we're kind of basing these judgments on from a quantitative standpoint, I kind of have to hold my nose, because some of the things that are counted as official development assistance have nothing to do with development. And third, and it's, you know, we had an election a few months ago, and politics have changed a bit in the U.S., especially in Congress, and especially in the House of Representatives, with a new majority and a new emphasis on deficit reduction. So we really kind of now, it's not just, well, we don't have any choice but to stop talking about quantity and invest in qualitative improvements. And I just want to give you a sense of what this is going to mean for the U.S., what I think it's going to mean. I think we haven't finished our budget for 2011 yet. You know, we're only, you know, we're not halfway through our fiscal year, but you know, why rush into things? I think it'll be settled in March, and the best scenario I see is that global development assistance programs will be reduced by 10% from what President Obama wanted for this year, and that's the best case scenario, and it's actually looking not too bad compared to other scenarios. Another scenario, at the other extreme, some members of Congress are talking about going back to the pre-stimulus spending levels of 2008. And just to give you an idea of what that would mean, for the entire international affairs budget of the U.S., it would mean a reduction of 42% compared to what President Obama wanted right now. And for specific programs, global health would be cut by about 20%. They get off pretty good. Food security, the new Feed the Future initiative, that's a cornerstone of the Obama administration. The resources would be 75% of what he requested, 75% less than what he requested, basically gutting the initiative. But I think the most important cut that would result is not in any really dramatic, programmatic things that save lives and improve quality of life. It's something that's really boring, but is always a really target, but I think is critical, and that is the operating expenses of the U.S. Agency for International Development would be cut by more than 50%. Now, they've invested in the last 3 years a tremendous amount in improving what was really a crippled agency, increasing the staff levels, hiring the skill sets they need, getting the training that the development offers, making development a discipline unto itself, and that would be wiped out. And so no matter how much money you're spending on great programs, if you don't have the skills, the management, the capacity to monitor, to measure impact, you're going to waste your money. And that's something that concerns me a great deal, and something I hope that this time around that those making the budget decision will recognize that that's just an equally important part of spending as is the program money itself. So it's the right thing to do with this focus on aid effectiveness, but it's also about the only path we have right now for moving ahead, because we're not going to be talking about growth. Now, the U.S. in the past has been so way behind the rest of the international community on aid effectiveness. The U.S. was not engaged in the debates coming out of the Paris Declaration or CRA, but that's changing, and it's a different mindset that some of the officials coming into the Obama administration have brought with them. And I was interested in, there's a, USAID had commissioned a survey of how the U.S. government was adjusting, was putting into place mechanisms for greater aid effectiveness along the lines of Paris Declaration and the CRA principles. And they did this starting in the spring, moving towards the summer. And one of the things the authors have said is that as they got further into their discussions, the vocabulary was changing among American officials in various aid agencies, and that in fact a lot of them had never heard of the Paris Declaration, didn't know what it was, but nevertheless they were talking the talk. It was something that was a really change in vocabulary and mindset that was going on. It's something that's really quite remarkable from where I sat for so many years, that this got no traction at all in previous administrations. So I'm going to lay out some policy decisions that have been made recently that have promised to set in place some real improvements in the quality, the effectiveness, and the overall potential impact of U.S. development programs. These are two parallel policy packages, one directed out of the White House called the Presidential Policy Directive. The second was driven out of the State Department and USAID, called the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, the QDDR. And in a way, they were both launched in mid-2009. At the same time, almost, it was clearly, there was a sense of competition. Who was going to get through? Who was going to have their policy out there first? Was it going to be Secretary Clinton's staff, or was it going to be President Obama's staff? And in some ways, I kept reflecting, I'm trying to remind myself exactly who had won the Democratic primary in December in 2008. Because sometimes it looked like, in this issue anyway, the second place finisher was in the driver's seat. That isn't made, actually, they turned out fairly consistent with one another, but it did require some adult supervision and trying to end a year-and-a-half-long food fight between some fairly highly respected individuals. So on the White House policy, some of the major aid effectiveness points that emerge from that. First of all, this is about development policy. It's not just about development assistance. It's including our trade policy, our migration, refugee, immigration, our investment directives as well. Taking this all of government, I hate to use that phrase, but across all government, the U.S. has about 23, 24 different agencies involved in development and development assistance. And we often forget the fact that USAID and the State Department, if I was going to ask you who manages most of our development assistance budget, you'd say USAID and then the State Department, and you're right, but it's only about 50%. All the other 23 agencies manage the other 50%. So trying to capture all the development elements of all those other agencies beyond assistance is a major part of the President's new directive. Also, focusing on development outcomes rather than inputs and outputs. I mean, we have the system of how much we spend on basic education or the environment or microenterprise, and that's where the discussion stops. Well, that doesn't tell you anything. So there's much more rigorous on outcomes and a lot less more attention just on the amount of money we're putting in. We are another important tenet is to move away from these vertical programs like the president, like PEPFAR, the HIV/AIDS initiative, the Bush administration, which was very, very good as an emergency intervention to scale up quickly, but it did have consequences of setting up parallel processes, not working with governments to build their capacity or to work with them in these efforts, and now shifting to what's called the Global Health Initiative. The administration is trying to put and partner with countries and help them build systems rather than work on the sides to address these problems. The idea of mutual accountability, not just accountability for the U.S. as an aid donor, but the accountability of governments to manage and effectively use the resources provided to achieve the outcomes warranted. And this really has a foundation in the creation of the Millennium Challenge Corporation 6-7 years ago, where decisions on where to invest are based on the best operating governments. Another tenet, which is going to be an interesting one to see how it's put in place, is the issue of selectivity. The U.S. is now saying that we can't do everything. We couldn't ever do anything, but sometimes we try to pretend. Now we're saying we just can't do it. And we've got to be selective, and we've got to invest where we have the greatest impact, and also work with other partners where they would be most effective in making their investments. This is going to be really, really hard to do. And there's no ambassador operating around the world for the United States that wants to terminate their aid program in their country. There will be great heartburn within the advocacy community when the U.S. says, well, we're minimizing our investments in water or education, for example. There will be winners and there will be losers, and this is going to be one of the toughest things, I think, for the administration to put in place. But I do think there's clear signals that there's going to be an effort to de-emphasize development assistance in Latin America, and there'll be some closing of USAID missions in Eastern Europe that are, holdover from the 90s. Owen talked about greater transparency, and this is now a mantra of the U.S. It's shocking. Where a few years ago, this guy had a lot to do with it, and I encourage you to go to a website at USAID. It's their dashboard. I can't remember. I think it's called foreignassistance.gov, but it's their dashboard, and it lays out the data of where the United States invests its money, countries, sectors, regions, etc. And there's really nothing new there. It's just a collection of it. It makes it easier to get out so you can understand it. Really, everything is there. But what they're promising over the next several years is really revolutionary, and I think will, if they fully implement it, will make the U.S. one of the most transparent donors in the world. They want to get down to where you can click on a country and then see all the programs, click on the programs and see who the implementing partners are, and then click on the programs and see the impact evaluations that have been done on that project. All in one place, all 3 or 4 clicks away. They're also promising to get all U.S. agencies to participate in this, and I think they'll have some success, but the one I'm looking at is the Defense Department and how well they're going to go along with this era of transparency. The last thing with the President's policy is they clearly define that USAID is going to be lead U.S. development policy in the field, and that has not been the case. And there will be a few exceptions. Pakistan and Afghanistan. I don't really think that USAID will be running the show there, but for the most part it will. And this has been one of the weaknesses that we've been having these multiple voices, not only in Washington but in the field. The second policy package was coming out of USAID as a result of the QDDR, was something called USAID Forward. And the thing that excites me the most, and that everybody just kind of glazes over when I mention this, is the changes coming in our procurement and contracting area of USAID. And that's really boring stuff. And for somebody like me who works for an advocacy organization, they don't even want to hear about this stuff because their membership think they're crazy if they start talking about this. But here's what we're trying to do is, first of all, instead of using international or U.S. implementers, NGOs, contractors, we're going to start looking around to hire local contractors. Not only building capacity in the country, but spending more money in the country. It has lots of dividends. And we're going to start using country systems to larger extent, and they're going to start using smaller and less complicated contracting systems rather than 17 pages. Another very minor thing that hardly everybody talks about, but USAID is going to elevate the status of their foreign service nationals who work for the agency. Foreign service nationals are locals who work for USAID missions. They're really the backbone. They're career people. They come from the ministries. They're top economists. They're people with experience in the country, and they don't move in and out every 3 or 4 years. And probably about maybe 60–70% of USAID workforce are foreign service nationals. For a long time, we just conflated foreign service nationals that work on development with foreign service nationals that drive cars and do other tasks at the embassy. And now we're going to make the USAID foreign service nationals real development professionals and recognize their skills. And I think this will have a major impact on the effectiveness, if not the morale. They've reinstalled a policy capacity at USAID and initiated multi-year country-based strategies. That seems like kind of no-brainer stuff, but 5 years ago, under the last administration, that policy bureau within USAID was abolished, and they went back to one-year operational plans that were largely driven out of Washington. Monitoring and evaluation has been strengthened significantly, and there's a focus now on innovation and encouragement of risk-taking by USAID staff rather than risk avoidance, which has been for so long. So now we're at the stage of trying to implement this. We've got 2 years in this administration, maybe 6, but we can't count on more than 2. And it's going to be very difficult for these things to get traction. Some of the major challenges in doing this: how is USAID going to convince the rest of the U.S. government to follow its lead in the field? Is it possible to really integrate all these development policy tools across the U.S. government and bring them to bear in one collective sense? And I think that's one of the toughest things that they'll have in front of them. Policy coherency. How do we adjust our development policy with some of our domestic policies that kind of undercut our development goals? And I'm not very optimistic about this, but the first test will be next year when we have our every 5-year Farm Bill debate, and there will be strong push to reform our food aid policy. And if the movement can happen there, then maybe we've got a chance to move down the road of policy clearance. And remember, reforming food aid means saving money, so I'm hoping that that's going to be convincing to some of our new members of Congress. Getting away from the DC-driven strategies and resource allocation decisions is another challenge, and that's going to take an effort from the Congress to reduce earmarking at the global level, from the White House and the President deciding on his pet projects and throwing a lot of money at them and saying, you figure out how to do with everything else. It also has a challenge for the advocacy committee, or community, which is one driving a lot of these global sector earmarks. Take the advocacy to the field. Start working there to build these country strategies so that when you get back to Washington, they're already the right principles and the amount of resources aligned with those strategies. Not do it in Washington that you have no idea of whether it's the appropriate thing to do. Whether development has really been elevated, I'm hopeful that it has, but we're going to be seeing that over the next couple of years, and basically this comes down to whether development is development and USAID still close to the State Department to avoid short-term political emphasis, and that's something to be seen. It's a bit ironic that that we are at a time when a year and a half ago these 2 policy initiatives were promised within a few months, and it took a year and a half to get there. And they rolled out just the time as a new membership in Congress was rolling into Washington, based on more government efficiency, streamlining, effectiveness, reduced costs. And I think right now there's a real opportunity for the administration, at least in the development field, to be a little bit out in front of that. They have a plan now to do the things that the new Congress wants the government to do. It's up to the administration to convince the Congress that they have it right, and to the Congress to let them do it. Thank you.
Great. So I want to thank the 3 speakers for great presentations, and not only that, but also all 3 of these gentlemen have been at our conference for a couple of days now, so it's been a real privilege for us to have them around, and the benefit to the membership to be able to have access to knowledge like this. I couldn't help thinking throughout all 3 presentations that something that seemed a really important theme was the significance of political decision making in making all of these things happen, and making aid work, and making it work even better than it currently is. And I don't think it's surprising to consider that for many years there have been people equally as smart as the 3 of you who are advising governments, who are providing ideas for what needs to be done to continually strengthen the quality of what we're doing. And yet we see, as is evidenced in some of the points that Ian made, that change comes brutally slow, and that perhaps there are reasons for that other than just, you know, are the ideas good enough? Do we have the right policy prescriptions? And so I'm going to open it up for questions because we've got a good half hour for that. But I wanted to ask the first one, and it's just to say, you know, part of what Larry was saying in terms of the hope that's been built in the last few years around really making important strides on improving American development, and certainly as Owen is a Brit, DFID and the UK development assistance is consistently held in extremely high regard, and he was part of making that happen himself. And so I'm wondering what the political environment was, what happened to allow good decisions to be made and to really make the progress that we have the information to make. And I mean politically, because I think that that is a core. We can't just have good ideas and continue to throw them around smart people. We need to be able to translate that into a political arena.
I can say it in 3 words: change of government. In Britain, DFID was probably one of the, I'm trying to think of the right word, probably one of the most, I'm trying to think of the right word. DFID was not a very good development organization. The Blair government decided that there would be a quantum leap. There was going to be a major change, and they made it happen. I mean, both in creating a strong ministry, putting a full cabinet minister in place, and making sure that it was somebody who was tough and who wouldn't be kicked around. I think that was a very important part of it. But there was a lot of other things too that turned DFID from a slush fund for defense contractors into something much more profound, and is now, and became very quickly one of the best of the bilateral agencies out there. And I think what Larry's talking about is the same thing, a complete change in mindset. It didn't happen because one person became, and there was a new president. It happened, I mean, the backstory that Larry can tell is a huge amount of work to persuade the Obama administration, both before it became the administration and afterwards, what had to happen. But you need to have political will to do this, and I think that's part of our problem in this country.
So you urge speakers to be frank. I'm going to disagree with you about this. I don't believe in great men in the theories of history that this happened because there was a change of government. It happened because of changes in the social economic context in the UK. The end of the Cold War was an important driver of this, because during the Cold War, we'd been using aid to drive our geostrategic interests, and the end of exchange controls abolished. I mean, most of you, all of you, in fact, are too young to remember exchange controls. But this used to be, you know, balance of payments was what lost the Conservatives the election in the 1970s. Lost Labour the election in the 1970s. So the end of exchange controls, so the end of the obsession with getting export profit created an opportunity for a change in the UK. And what's interesting about that change was that every Labour government since the war has set up a separate aid ministry, and every Conservative government since the war has reintegrated that aid ministry back into foreign affairs. So this was not an unusual event. The thing that was unusual was why it was a success this time, and why it was sustained this time compared to the previous occasions. And the answer to that is I think because of this change of context in people's attitudes to foreign assistance, as a way, people were moving away from it as a way of driving geostrategic and commercial interests, to the idea that it was in our long-term interest to have more prosperous nations around the world. People, you know, Britain is a very open global society, and the consequences of drugs. I mean, don't forget this happened long before 9/11. So this was before we were all talking about terrorism. This was when we were thinking about the worries about immigration pressures were beginning to concern people. People were concerned about drugs. But most of all, people, I think, felt a moral obligation to other people around the world. I think this was genuinely driven by a public mood that the march of globalization couldn't continue as long as there was widening inequality. When part of the world was benefiting from globalization and part of the world wasn't, that was eventually going to act as a brake on the globalization process. So I think it was a sense of global inequality being, in the end, bad for Britain. Not in the sense that they're going to come over and blow up our planes, because it was before all that. So I think there was a political mood for changing the role of development in the UK. But I don't think it was just because of the change of government, because we've had that before, and we've had that particular change before. What the Labour government did in '97 that was smart was creating the cabinet minister, which we've had before. Judith Hart was cabinet minister and so on. But they also gave the department a mandate not just to manage an aid programme, but to manage a development policy. So, for example, and this is going to sound weird to anybody who isn't British, when I was last in DFID, I was in charge of UK international trade negotiations. Okay, the development ministry led for the UK government on trade negotiations. And that's why the UK has a very pro-development trade policy, because it's the development ministry that leads it. They put into DFID not only responsibility for managing the aid programme, but for being responsible right across government. I was funding, out of my budget in DFID, I wasn't funding, the UK taxpayer was funding, out of my budget in DFID, a programme to reduce international corruption. So we were paying money to the Serious Organised Crime Agency in the UK to identify British firms that were making corrupt payments overseas. So that wasn't an aid project, because it was a payment to another part of the British government. But we were doing the anti-corruption effort to make sure the British government was as active in overseas corruption as we were in fighting corruption at home. So that mandate for development and not just aid was hugely important. And then this mission, this very clear mission to reduce global poverty. And this combination of the mission to reduce global poverty, the mandate to do development and not just aid, and the institutional changes, locked together a survivable change, a change that has continued into the current Conservative government. I think any of those on its own wouldn't have worked. If we'd just had the change of mission, just had just been an aid ministry, or just had the change of structure, it wouldn't have worked. But those three together, I think, formed a pyramid that, or what's the word, a tripod that made this change very stable, and I think is now irreversible in the UK system.
Let me just, I probably come down on this between the two, Owen and Ian. I'll just give a few examples of what I think has made this transition in the US. Change of government has had an impact, but it goes back really to previous administrations as well. First thing, I'll just give a sense, the politics does matter here, but in a very strange way, and this will give you an insight into sort of the sausage making of US legislation and what motivates certain initiatives to come forward. You know, right now probably about 1/4 of the US development assistance budget is focused on health, or I should say our total foreign assistance budget is on global health. It started really growing in the mid-90s with the creation of a separate child survival account focused on children needs. And you know, you think about, well, you know, I studied it and decided this was an intervention that the U.S. could achieve some results, it was important, et cetera, et cetera. That wasn't it at all. In fact, in 1995, when the Republicans had just taken over the House of Representatives, they had introduced and passed some what were perceived as very anti-children domestic legislation, cutting back school feeding programs and several other things. And their public opinion was really turning against the Republicans as not being in support of children or meeting their needs. And so the word came down to the Appropriations Committee, where I was on a detail at that time, figure out how much we're spending on children overseas and double it. And out of that came the child survival account. And then it was picked up and built from there. So that gives you an idea about weird things, just random things. But I would say probably the thing that changed public opinion in the United States and policymaker and lawmaker positions on the value of global development and the effort to increase resources and to make it work better was 9/11. I mean, it was a really change in the psyche of Americans that our military cannot defend our security on its own, and this whole notion that failed and failing states are a threat to U.S. security in the United States was just had a huge impact. And so you started to get a sense of different coalitions coming together, including retired military and the private sector, and calling for greater strength of civilian power, of a civilian capacity, which we had long neglected. And so during the Bush administration, you had responses like PEPFAR, as well as strategic focus foreign assistance as well. It was, our aid budgets were going like this, but it wasn't just because of helping what are called frontline states in the war on terrorism. It was also our PEPFAR, our health budget was going up, the Millennium Challenge Corporation was established. It wasn't exactly a coherent way to do it, but it was moving in a direction that would allow us to try to deal with the effectiveness issues we have today. And I'll just say it was also influenced by a number of a steady drumbeat from beginning in about 2003, 2004 of studies coming out of think tanks and commissions. The book On the Brink talked about many of these things, security by other means. And then a group I was involved with was a congressionally mandated commission to look at how we could reform our foreign assistance programs called the Help Commission. 21 commissioners, 16 of them were Republicans. So it wasn't exactly the most balanced commission. But what came out of that commission was that development assistance should be a core element of U.S. foreign policy. And no matter what happens going forward, status quo was unacceptable. And that was from a highly, highly concentrated Republican group. All of those things kind of set the stage then when you have Obama, who came in and his campaign developed a whole package of promises and proposals that could be acted upon. And, putting myself in the advocacy world at this point, when the president was elected, we thought it was a slam dunk that all these things would go into place. And then, of course, there's a lot of other things he had to deal with. And but in any case, it moved forward because President Obama, but there was a lot of basis for that permitted it to move forward prior to him taking office.
Great. Let's take some quick questions from the audience. And remember to speak up because people are far back in the room. Go ahead.
Sphere recently, there's been a lot of discussion of that being an international development worker is a profession, and that not just anyone can do that job, but you need certain expertise to make these decisions. But on the other hand, we know that public engagement is really important, and public support is really important because we want foreign aid policy to bring culture and both government and private support. So I'm wondering where that balance is.
I think this is a really important change, and I do think this is part of the challenge of foreign assistance reform and development policy reform. I mean, to generalize wildly, part of the problem of the development system is that various vested interests and rent seekers politically drive in ways that Ian was describing, in the case of Canada, but across the world, aid money that could be used for poverty reduction to be used for all kinds of other things. They're used for ineffective aid programs that end up subsidizing the Beltway bandits and their equivalents around the world, that are used for military or commercial objectives. And I don't think that's what citizens want, right? I think what's happening here is exactly like free trade negotiations. What happens is there are big vested interests who gain from something, who are more vocal, more powerful, more effective lobbyists. than the general mass of the population who aren't that engaged, aren't that involved, but have a rather vague feeling that they'd like their money to be used for poverty reduction rather than for winning firms for construction companies. And the question is, how do we marshal that army of people, of well-meaning, moderately like people who have a general disposition towards the money being well used, but don't care enough about it to do anything about it. How do we marshal that army of people and outvote and put the political pressure, make that political pressure stronger than the vocal interest groups who want to use this money for all kinds of ineffective purposes? And that means more than putting out press releases saying, look at this jolly good aid project that we did today. And I think the public mood is changing. I think the public mood is changing in right across the public realm, the public sphere. The people are willing. We don't need to engage the entire citizenry of a country, right? But what you need is a small number of people. And here at this conference, it's quite a large number of people, and this movement is very impressive, who are willing to put in a bit of time to be involved. It's astonishing how, in other, when the MP's expenses scandal happened in the UK, the Guardian newspaper put up the raw receipts and stuff that had been leaked onto their website, and 25,000 people on the first day participated in a program just to go through them and flag up the things that looked odd or interesting or scandalous. Now, 25,000 people on the one hand is, what is that, 0.1% of the adult population. On the other hand, that's a hell of a lot of people, collectively participating in a program to hold our MPs to account. So you could have, 0.1% of the population who are willing to be engaged in some way in aid. And we saw this with the Haiti earthquake when people were doing the crowdsourcing of the maps, so that within hours there was an online up-to-date map of Port-au-Prince, which hadn't existed before. People were taking this. People want to do this, and I think a lot of people care about global injustice and poverty and want to be engaged. So I think that aid agencies need to stop with the communications explaining to business and start thinking about how do we engage people in our aid programs. And the problem is that a lot of aid professionals don't really get that. There's a lot of professional groups, and this isn't the point about aid professionals, this is the point about professionals, right? It may even be true of some engineers. People don't, there's institutional change to that. In my optimistic modes, I think that people will get how important this is over time. In my pessimistic modes, I worry that they won't, and that will have very bad consequences for public support for development, if they think that the aid industry is standoffish and not willing to engage them. This is, after all, their money. And just to give you one fact, in 2013, when the British aid budget increases, the average tax-paying family in the UK will be having spent on their behalf £500 per family per year on foreign assistance. Okay? £500 per family per year that DFID is spending on their behalf. They're not going to just let DFID do what they please with that. They're going to want to be involved in how that money is spent, and that's absolutely right and proper that they should.
If we could try and keep it brief, and I'll take one more question.
If you do public opinion polls, and CETA has done a lot of these public opinion polls over the last 20, 25 years, if you do public opinion polls and ask, how many people are in favor of foreign aid as it is, or should it be increased, it depends when you ask the question. If you ask the question during a budget tightening exercise or close to a budget cutting exercise when other things are getting cut, you'll see that the attitudes are not as positive as they might be otherwise. But if you were to ask today, for example, you'd probably see that public support is pretty high. But I think probably most of us know that public support for international development or development assistance, however people understand it, is a mile wide and an inch deep. People don't understand it very well. And there aren't very many ways to find out much about it. If you look at the websites of CEDA or NGOs, they don't tell you very much. It's all great news, it's all positive, we're doing wonderful things, there's no problems. EWB's got a failure report, but don't look at that. There really isn't very much explanation. And if you look at how the average Canadian who supports international development assistance through donation sees it, I'd say 75% of all public donations to Canadian NGOs outside of the churches are going for child sponsorship. So they're seeing it all through the lens of what I can do as a surrogate parent, and we talk about paternalism, for children. I know the child sponsorship agencies don't just give pencils and school books to kids. I know they do community development, and I know they explain that, but that's not how people are brought into that kind of support. So the way we engage Canadians, we treat them like morons. We treat them like cows to be milked for money. And CEDA's got and has had some tremendous public engagement programs. There's one, I don't know if it's still there, but it's a co-financing arrangement for filmmakers. And if you think you can get your film on TV, CEDA will co-sponsor it. And of course, TV is extremely important. Most people get their information from television, so that kind of thing is extremely important. But if you look at CEDA's public engagement budget, I think, maybe wrong, but I think it's about 10% of the fundraising budget of World Vision in this country. 11. CEDA just isn't putting enough money into that. CEDA should put a heck of a lot more money into it. And NGOs should do a lot more of what Engineers Without Borders is doing. Sponsor a spreadsheet, not a child.
I'm going to upset our nice volunteer in the back who's trying to hurry me along because we're over time already, and ask for one more question. And I know that Jim had his hand up, so I'm going to get it. Ask him.
I do. I'm going to use the mic. I want to congratulate all of you for coming out and giving us an insight of what the bureaucracy is. And I've always advocated and I've always said, democracies are not democracies, they're bureaucracies. And although you might say that you need a strong minister to move things, unless you have a strong deputy minister and the bureaucracy underneath to support the minister, you're not going anywhere. I've seen personally what happens to members of parliament that go in and say, I'm going to change the world. Guess what? You get brown paper, brown enveloped. So one of the things that in all our countries that we have, United States, Canada, and Britain, is the ethnic communities, the multicultural communities, the people that come from different countries, fleeing things or coming to those countries for better development. Now, I've always said this, and I'll say it again, and food for thought, and you can maybe comment. CEDA, USAID, or British Aid, we never use the ethnic communities and provide them sustainable development for nation building. Rarely have I seen in the field, be it in Pakistan, be it in Afghanistan, be it in Africa or anywhere else in the world, rarely have I seen a locally engaged individual that is from Britain, that is from Canada or the United States. We have failed completely, time and time again, to utilize the communities. And yet these communities go to MPs, MPs write to the minister, it goes somewhere in the bureaucracy and it gets lost. There's programs that the communities want to do. There's programs that the communities in Canada want to go exist and match dollar for dollar in order to do. And unfortunately, that has never shaped, this has never taken place. I've seen many a times that you have 2 or 3 cars that are going, be it CEDA, be it USAID or British, and you got the guy that's doing the evaluation in the middle, and you got a truck in the back and the front with guns. Had we hired a local from Canada and sent him back to Afghanistan or somewhere else, he wouldn't need the entourage. We have failed to do that. Why is it that, although you're saying, sir, in the United States that you're looking for people that live in those countries, locally engaged staff, why not get staff from the United States that come from those countries? Those are the best people that know what is needed back there. They're citizens of the country that you're progressing and you're promoting. And can you imagine what we can do with our citizens in building nations and making sure that they're developing and they're developing in the right direction? I'll leave that food for thought, and if you guys want to make any comments, let's listen.
Anybody want to comment on that?
I agree.
I agree as well. I have seen a greater effort to do this, not from our aid agencies, and it's really in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Americans, well, Afghanis and Iraqis who have moved to the United States, established businesses doing quite well, have looked for opportunities to go back and take their expertise, their investments, and their businesses back to those countries. And I think the U.S. is supporting that, but not as part necessarily of our development assistance effort. It's something on the side. I agree that it is an opportunity that should be explored and expanded.
I think this is changing. I think you'll find a lot of people from developing countries, new Canadians or second-generation Canadians in CETA today, and certainly in the Department of Foreign Affairs. And it's changing somewhat among NGOs. The NGO that I chair, the Diamond Development Initiative, we only have 3 staff. One is, they're all Canadian citizens, but one originally came from the Congo, one from Cameroon, and one from Benin. There are people who want to get in, who want to do these things, and they are often much, much better. And we didn't hire them because they were from Africa. We hired them because they were the best.
Great, so I'm really sorry. I think we could go on for hours, but we can't. So, to the chagrin of everyone else who's trying to get me to hurry along. So please join me in thanking the 3 speakers for